Okay, so decently long episode coming up, so strap in. Got 2 movies and 2 albums to talk about, along with a handful of singles and trailers that caught my attention during this 2-week period. So let's get started with a movie that came out on Amazon Prime Video on the 5th of February. Stars Owen Wilson and Salma Hayek. It's directed by Mike Cahill. It's called Bliss. Yeah, so this movie was inoffensive crap of the most plastic variety. A movie with one decent idea that it doesn't have any clue what to do with, and ultimately ends up stretching so thin to the point of total thematic incomprehensibility. Basically, Greg is the main character, played by Owen Wilson, and he has a pretty boring office job. But when he realizes he's been living in a simulated reality, he has to choose between breaking free from the simulation and just going back to his normal life. If that sounds interesting to you, then yeah, you'd be right, that is pretty interesting stuff. I covered Netflix's Sightless a couple of weeks back and I made the exact same observation. Unfortunately, the world building in this film is so flimsily articulated that it stops being interesting in record time. When Greg is first told that he's living in a simulation, he needs remarkably little convincing, and thus it's hard to take his character all that seriously. There isn't really a lot to any of the characters in this movie, apart from the most generic father-daughter relationship that plays out exactly as you'd expect. For a movie so lacking in interesting character, you'd expect the plot to be more of the focus and to be more interesting, but the movie is remarkably thin in that department too, relying more on vaguely sketched abstract concepts in order to make its point about living in the present and acknowledging reality simply as what it is and not getting lost in your own head. Further problems arise as far as the plot goes, and you realize that what the movie is doing with those ideas is again the furthest thing from interesting. There is literally a scene in this movie where an important character shoots another important character and he dies, an action that for the record has no bearing on the plot whatsoever, that ends up just being shrugged off as a careless mistake and given no time beyond that. It's almost as if the movie is going out of its way to reinforce the lack of any kind of dramatic stakes. Pair this with how abortive a lot of the character arcs are, Isabel's in particular, and you have a painfully mediocre movie that feels forced, rushed, and thoughtless. I will give some credit for what the movie is trying to do thematically, but it feels like the most sterile and derivative take on those themes that you could possibly imagine. In other words, it sucks, and it gets a 4 out of 10 from me. Amazon Prime Video has a lot better to offer than this. So now that's dealt with, we can move on to Netflix's new film, Malcolm and Marie, directed by Sam Levinson, starring John David Washington and Zendaya in the respective title roles. It also came out on the 5th of February. Okay, I'm going to attempt to keep this fairly short because you should totally just see this movie. But yeah, to the surprise of nobody, I thought it was great. It's certainly an acquired taste, and it might be a little bit too muted for some people to really get into, but this is a movie that prides itself on atmosphere, and if you can tap into that atmosphere, you are in for a great ride. This might be one of the most purest romance films I've ever seen, as the dynamic between our two characters shifts before our very eyes, with both John David Washington and especially Zendaya putting in remarkable performances and showcasing their incredibly sensual chemistry extremely well. The monologues in particular that both these actors deliver are both exquisitely written and perfectly performed. So as far as I can tell, it was the dialogue that probably ended up being the biggest point of contention coming out of this movie for a lot of people. But again, I also think it's great. I think it's really well written. Sure, it might be the furthest thing from realistic, but I think some people have overplayed the extent to which this is actually a problem. After all, both actors command the screen so well and absolutely sell the lines that they are given to deliver, and therefore I find it very difficult to complain. I guess there are elements of the dialogue that might come across as a little pretentious to some, but writer and director Sam Levinson balances out the gloomy romance with some sequences that are more lively and legit laugh out loud funny. Seriously, hearing John David Washington kind of swath through film critics in the most ridiculous and overblown way possible, that was something I didn't know I needed until I got it. His overacting just adds so much to the scene for me, it didn't detract from it. And seeing Zendaya quietly lying there just laughing to herself as she sees all this unfold is just so damn funny. How both actors were able to keep their cool during that scene is honestly probably forever be a mystery to me. And speaking of mysteries, the plot of this movie is a bit of an enigma, and you could argue it doesn't even have one. It is just two people arguing about their relationship after all. But crucially, and this is very important, neither Malcolm nor Marie are framed entirely as either being in the right or being in the wrong. Nobody is antagonized, and therefore the movie ends up painting a remarkably balanced picture. But that doesn't say that this is a movie lacking in purpose, beyond just acting as a talent showcase for our two main stars. Despite its overbearing moments, it's a profoundly human story about attachment, why we love in the first place, and where we get the strength to keep loving even in dire times. You can't put a price on love, and this movie gets that. The very idea of love and relationships can be kind of difficult to contextualize, and can often be the result or lead to irrationality. And the events of this movie are just one example of that playing out on screen. Not to mention the movie is immaculately presented in every way. Artsy, but by no means showy about it. The long takes are glorious, the cinematography is consistently excellent and intimate, and the story makes it all worthwhile. But that being said, I do have a few criticisms. This is a movie that I do wish picked a lane a little bit more often, as the juxtaposition between the moments of sensual intimacy and the moments of overbearing shoutiness can come across a little jarring, as does the impression that all of what you're seeing in the film takes place in a single night. The pacing isn't quite perfect. But other than that, this rules. I can see why some aren't gelling with it as much as me, as it does demand you tune your brain to a very specific frequency. But if you can manage to tune your brain to it like I can, it is so worth it. 8 out of 10, you should definitely check it out. Now for a few trailers that have come out recently, starting with the latest from Netflix again, Moxie, directed by Amy Poehler, and starring Josie Tota, Josephine Langford, and Marcia Gay Harden. It comes out on the 3rd of March. Okay, so on paper, this looks like a movie that has been made for me especially. It appears to be about a girl who sets up a zine for her school in an attempt to kickstart a revolution against the patriarchy. And I was very happy watching this trailer and discovering that it doesn't look like this movie's going to be taking itself all that seriously, thriving more on that bubbly, fluffy, infectious energy rather than overstating its message into oblivion. It looks like it's going to be pretty on the nose, but in a good way, in a way that helps make its point rather than undermining it. I have my fingers crossed for this one. Hopefully Netflix doesn't let us down. Next up, The Courier, directed by Dominic Cook and starring Benedict Cumberbatch, Mirab Nins, and Rachel Brosnahan, which comes out on the 19th of March. So this is basically looks like a Cold War movie where Benedict Cumberbatch plays a Bond-like character. And I thoroughly expect that to be the extent of the movie's appeal. That doesn't mean to say that I expect it to be bad by any means. After all, Cumberbatch's undeniable charisma is likely to make up for a lot, and he does seem incredibly well cast in the role. Now that's all well and good, but I think a lot is going to depend on whether or not this movie is going to be able to cater to my ever-shortening attention span, and not just descend into convoluted mush. It all hinges on the tone and narrative being streamlined and accessible enough to understand. Still looks pretty good though. Hopefully I'll have the opportunity to check this one out. Finally, Crisis, directed by Nicholas Jarecki, starring Gary Oldman, Armie Hammer, and Evangeline Lilly, which comes out on the 26th of March. Honestly, I'm kind of excited for this one. It seems to be a movie about drugs, both the industry that supplies them and the people who use them. Of course, how well the movie will end up balancing those two unique narrative threads while preserving the human core of the story remains to be seen. Although that subplot where it looks like the mother of the kid that is being killed smuggling drugs, hunting down the person who dealt them, it's an interesting direction it looks like. That revenge narrative could actually be pretty fascinating. I really hope that is the main focus of the story, but somehow I kind of doubt it. Foregrounding the humanity that lies at the core of these situations is gonna be a key factor in whether this is going to work properly or not. And I have hope it will. I'll definitely be checking this one out. Okay, so now on to albums. I'll be starting off with the debut album from Victon. It's called Voice, The Future Is Now. It came out on the 11th of January. So my album of the year at the moment is Idol's I Burn, a K-pop album that oozed the kind of overblown pop melodrama that I eat for breakfast. It's the first K-pop album that I've truly loved, and it's given me the motivation to go looking for some new artist in the scene. And I did some digging and found that Victon released their debut album on the same day as Idol's I Burn came out. Unfortunately, that might have set expectations way too high. Because while Voice, The Future Is Now is a decent album, it's very clear that Victon are not a group willing to take the same artistic risks that Idol were on I Burn. In contrast, this album is a lot more conventional in both its production and songwriting. It goes down pretty easy most of the time, but there's an underlying sloppiness to it that makes it impossible to enjoy on the level that I wanted to. Now, to give some credit, the group do have writing credits on most of their songs, with Hans taking the lead on most of them, which I appreciate. However, Hunter's voice might be the most whiny and obnoxious in the group. He sticks out like a sore thumb on songs like Circle and All Day as an obvious weakness, making me think that his talents might actually be better used keeping him behind the scenes rather than in front of the microphone. But when he gets the stage to himself, like on Where Is Love, he proves he can be an emotive presence behind the mic when he's not dropping into that rap cadence, and it ends up as one of the most emotionally impactful songs here. But even though this album does strike gold on occasion as far as that emotional impact goes, it's the production that ends up kind of compromising it across the board. It might not be as blaring as the worst K-pop that I've heard, but it is just as overstated and self-satisfied, with the lowest point being that wailing tone and overblown bass on the drop of Eyes on You that utterly destroys the momentum of a decent build-up, and the synth line on Unpredictable that legit sounds like a kazoo and probably would have been more at home on a below-average Blackpink song. The production might actually be at its most tolerable when it's the most understated, like on All Day, Carry On, and Where Is Love, the few moments of quiet reflection on what is a very in-your-face album. Or when the album just ditches restraint altogether. I actually found the sweeping, bombastic production on Circles remarkably magnetic. And I wish I could say the writing had the same magnetism, but it really doesn't. Unfortunately, this album flip-flops between broad, very generic themes of fighting through hard times and follow your dream stuff that we've heard 100 times before, like on Into the Mirror, What I Said, and Carry On, and love songs that are either painfully basic or about losing control that operate more as fan service than anything else. Just look at Up to You, All Day, and Unpredictable. The latter song, including a lyric that translates to, "With everything laid down, I just obey, even if you get hurt somewhere." Not sure that sits that well with me. But those songs are all innocent enough. But of the few remaining that do actually aim a little higher, well, it's a mixed bag. I'm willing to give some of these songs the benefit of the doubt because obviously I'm working off translations and I'm not Korean, but some of these metaphors just seem really confused. Circle is a song about running away from your problems, but if all you're doing is running in a circle, which the song describes, you're unlikely to get anywhere, and the band don't seem to acknowledge this. Flip a Coin has a similar problem, as in that the point of the song is that it's asserting their absolute dominance in the industry, but they use an expression that's usually associated with randomness, and by extension, precariousness. That kinda seems to fly in the face of their message if you think about it too hard. At least Chess is slightly more agreeable and grounded in its metaphor of comparing a toxic relationship to a game of chess, whereas the girl is making all the moves and they're just coasting through kind of enjoying it, while still acknowledging that they're playing a very dangerous game that will almost certainly end badly for both of them. And We Stay, it might be the best song on the album, at least the brightest and the most musically likable, as the group insists to their fans that they're not going anywhere anytime soon. They do have a long-term game here. Sure, it might be blatant fan service, but it's of the most wholesome variety. But the true standout on this album might be Where Is Love, a genuinely interesting song about how fame gets in the way of your perception of what is fake and what is real. And in a hyper-polished industry like the K-pop industry, how one might begin to question that in themselves. As K-pop stars, are they actually in fact more product than they are people? That's powerful stuff and not what I expected to hear coming onto this album. I really like that song. But to summarize, this is an album that manages to work on the strength of a few individual songs rather than anything all that thematically substantive. But having given the album a lot of listens, I can't deny that despite a few more low points than I was hoping for, that this is a decent debut album. The K-pop stans will probably really enjoy it, but as for me, as someone who enjoys a little bit more thematic cohesion, this was decent. I probably won't return to it, but I'm suddenly not unhappy that I heard it. 6 out of 10, pretty decent. Okay, second and last album of the episode, the debut album from Treasure. It's called The First Step, Treasure Effect. It also came out on the 11th of January. Okay, so I guess I've just been listening to a lot of K-pop recently. I don't really know why, especially when a lot of it isn't that great. And unfortunately, I'd include Treasure's debut album in that category. It's a pandering, clingy, badly produced album that encapsulates everything that I find hard to like about the genre. Firstly, the transitions into some of these rap verses are consistently clunky, and at least the songs like My Treasure, BLT, losing all their flow. And for an album that's trying to get through on effortless charm alone, The clumsiness is a big problem, but the production on this album as a whole isn't helping. There are a few songs that have decent pounding build-ups that are then utterly destroyed by these wretched EDM drops that stop the momentum dead in its tracks. Take that horrible buzzy tone on the chorus of Boy, for instance, or the ear-splitting, grinding drop on I Love You, or the honking, awkwardly fractured hook on Whoever is producing these sterile, overblown K-pop tunes clearly can't pick out a decent synth tone to save their life. Why on earth is that obnoxious whistle paired with that ugly pitched up vocal passing as a melody on Be With Me? What about how wailing and whiny the melody is on Come To Me? Honestly, this album, it just gives me a pounding headache more than anything. Thankfully, the album does stabilize a little bit by the end, with Orange being the most low-key song here, and Going Crazy being a decent closing track, where all the pounding momentum actually translates into a good hook. That song and BLT reminded me of the overproduced mainstream pop of the early 2010s, and that's a compliment. Unfortunately, as I've already alluded to, the songwriting on this album is clingy and pandering without being dramatic or interesting in the slightest, with Boy being the most obnoxious and mindlessly melodramatic song here. The result is that the writing on this album blurs together so much and has so little of substance it's hardly even really worth discussing, with the only songs of note being the reassurance to their fans that good times are on the horizon on My Treasure, the particularly horrendous clinginess on Come To Me, and the awkward goodbye on Orange that actually painted its scene pretty decently. As it is, this is by no means the worst thing in the world, but it's K-pop at its most clatteringly annoying, and thus it ends up a rather miserable experience. 5 out of 10 is pretty mediocre. Nothing more, nothing less. Now onto a few singles, and we're starting off with the latest one from Tom MacDonald that dropped on the 29th of January. It's called Fake Woke. Okay. Let me make one thing very clear straight away. I'm not objectively against the idea of this song, on paper at least. After all, looking at certain issues through the lens of someone who's white and privileged might provide an interesting, if not all that unique, perspective, especially if it's done with self-awareness, and an acknowledgement that the criticisms that he's dishing out for these systems are coming from a place of privilege. And that's the first of many issues with this song. Tom MacDonald is completely unaware that he is a privileged white man who's commenting on these issues from that perspective. Consequently, he ends up inserting himself into other people's narratives in the most self-obsessed way imaginable. And while I am by no means a psychologist, I think this song would give any forward-thinking human with more than 3 brain cells, let's say, the grounds to call Tom MacDonald delusional, or maybe diagnose him with narcissistic personality disorder, as he seems to tick a lot of the boxes given how much he appears to think that the world revolves around him. Now, we will be dismantling the lyrics of this track in a bit, don't you worry, but the problems with this song, they start really with the obvious. It sounds terrible. The guitar dissolves into overmixed sludge by the hook, where any kind of melody is just crushed outside the cheapest sounding synth line. And it's trying so hard to come across as edgy, but to me it just comes across as lazy. But obviously, that's not what most people are listening to this song for. That would be the lyrics, and in that department, the things wrong with this song seem to stretch on for miles. I guess we could start with the first verse, where he ends it by describing his hatred for cancel culture, and then follows it with the line, "Label everything we say as homophobic or racist. If you're white, then you're privileged, guilty by association. All our childhood heroes got Me Too'd or they're rapists." Oh my fucking god, how stupid are you? For one, maybe we label things as homophobic or racist for a reason that your stupid fucking brain that can't comprehend that people actually exist in this world that aren't as privileged as you can't understand. This is centuries of oppression that we're talking about. And you brushing that off with no sensitivity or regard for what you're saying is downright disgusting. But he follows that up with equating being white and therefore privileged, which he is and I am, and any white man who also happens to be watching this is, with being guilty. This is a white man who lives in LA and has a net worth of $100,000 refusing to acknowledge his own privilege. Fuck him. But obviously the most detestable line in that verse comes with where he implies that rapists need not be held accountable for their actions. Great, so he's racist, homophobic, and a rape apologist, and manages to cram all of that into the span of 3 lines. Great fucking job. But the blinding incompetence somehow doesn't stop there, because in the second verse he drops the line, I think Black Lives Matter was the stupidest name when the system's screwing everyone exactly the same. He doesn't explicitly use the phrase all lives matter, but both his writing and delivery are so blunt and declarative that he might as well have done, as if the racist implications weren't foregrounded enough. The All Lives Matter movement is pretty much the real-life embodiment of the "I'm not racist, but" comments that you get on social media that have been parodied into oblivion, that ends up doing an enormous disservice to the actual cause. Or, to use a Rick and Morty quote, that just sounds like racism but with extra steps. So now we've concluded that Tom MacDonald is racist, he goes on to downright say that the police are underfunded, which is not true and might be the most blindingly misinformed thing I've ever heard in a charting hit. And it shows just how far this guy is willing to go with his mindless clout chasing. He's gone from being a straight up dick to now just being a moron intent on spreading dumb misinformation. But he's not done there, because in one last ditch attempt to destroy all of his dignity, he tries to call out feminists by saying, "Feminism used to be the most righteous of fights, but these days it feels like they secretly hate guys." I wish I was surprised. Again, this guy seems oblivious of the centuries of oppression that women have faced throughout history in favor of projecting his smug, self-obsessed opinion onto all of it. But that's not the most reprehensible part of this song. None of what I've discussed is. Now that comes on the hook, where MacDonald drops the line, "Facts don't care about your feelings." And that's the point of this song. All of this barbaric, misinformed, offensive nonsense that he spends the song spewing, he's trying to pass off as facts that aren't up for debate. Again, if anyone needs any more evidence that this guy has narcissistic personality disorder, I don't know what to tell you. And it's just so frustrating. 2021 was supposed to be the year of recovery, and in many ways it is shaping up to be. The Trump administration has been disposed of. Here in the UK we have our vaccine rollout, and it's going pretty well, with around 15 million people having received their first dose of the time of this recording. Things are at least looking a little bit better for the future, but it's cultural moments like this and songs like this that could very well compromise that forward trajectory, and could well see us going backwards as a society, especially with the success that this song received for that brief moment. Let's collectively decide as a society to give this song no attention beyond this moment. Exactly what it fucking deserves. Okay, so now that's been dealt with, we can talk about Daya's new song. Her new track, Bad Girl, dropped on the 4th of February. Oh look, the Hideaway Girl is trying to sound like Halsey. How cute. Okay, look, it might not sound as badly produced as the worst songs on Sit Still Look Pretty, but it still sounds languid before the sharper percussion comes in and gives the song a little bit more momentum. And even then, it sounds tuneless and exhausted. As for the writing, well, Daya teamed up with Charlie Puth, among others, to make a reckless party song tinged with bisexuality, and wow, I wish it was more interesting beyond that really stilted cadence on the hook. Make no mistake, I'm gonna forget that this exists in record time, and I'm sure you will too if you've heard it. Next, new Dan and Shay. The new one came out on the 5th of February. It's called Glad You Exist. You know, I think I owe Justin Bieber an apology for criticizing his new single Anyone for trying to recapture the 10,000 hours formula, because Dan and Shay are basically pulling a Control-C, Control-V job with this song. I would call them pioneers in the boyfriend country subgenre, but calling them pioneers would suggest that they were doing something revelatory or interesting. And they're clearly doing neither with this. It even sounds like a song that they've made before. Putting the 10,000 hours comparison aside for a moment, the song musically recalls Can't Say No from their album Where It All Began. So not only is it boring lyrically, but it also sounds familiar musically. But the most hilarious thing to me is that if we just forget about the controversy that surrounds him for at least a moment, Morgan Wallen released More Surprised Than Me on his debut album Dangerous earlier this year. A song that does exactly what this track is trying to do, but with way better writing that was way more detailed, interesting, dramatic, richer, and had a more developed instrumental palette that sounds nowhere near as sterile as this does. I'll stick with that, because I'm sure not feeling this. On to the last two. Jonas Blue's latest song also dropped on the 5th of February. It's called Something Stupid. So Jonas Blue has been cranking out hits since 2015. Let that sink in for a moment. He's been an established hitmaker in the UK, if nowhere else, for over half a decade. After his remix of Fast Car went viral, even cracking the Billboard Hot 100, he's been lurking in the background of mainstream pop for a while now. And I love a lot of his hits. But given he spent 2020 without a UK charting hit, you may well call his consistent hitmaker status into question. This is his first single this year, where he will no doubt be wanting to put those questions to bed, and while I like it, I don't think intense restraint is the best lane for him, as the song does come across a lot sourer than it should. Then again, that might match the lyrics at least somewhat. Our sings about being on the precipice of opening up to this person a little bit too much. So much so that she feels the need to pull back in fear of sharing too much of her emotions that could potentially push this person away, especially as they're clearly not looking for any kind of deeper connection. Her hesitance is certainly justified, and this is a decent song, but I'm just not feeling it as much as some of his others like Mama and Polaroid. Finally, also dropping on the 5th of February, Cardi B's new one, Up. Yeah, so this song pretty much encapsulates the reason why I don't think I'll ever be a Cardi B fan. The thuddingly rigid melody on this track reminds me a lot of Money, her previous song, in the worst possible way. But the beat this time is a lot punchier, and the lyrics are a lot more graphic, which at least makes the song interesting. But unlike her previous hit, WAP with Megan Thee Stallion, all the personality feels like it's been stripped away. Instead of being amusing, the sex references feel a lot more mundane, and nowhere near as ridiculous as I did do on that song. I kind of get the impression the record label are banking on TikTok turning this song into a hit, as I can't see how it's likely to be all that sustainable otherwise. Don't really have any opinion on this song either way. And that was our week. Man, that was a rush job. Hopefully that didn't come across too much. Anyway, hopefully next week will be better than this. I'll see you then.